Wild West love stories. Tales of passion, written on the American frontier.
The air in the market square of Redemption's Bluff tasted of dust and desperation. Horses snorted, men shouted bids over cattle pens, but in one shadowed corner, the commerce was not of livestock, but of human souls. Elara Vance stood on a raised platform of rough-hewn planks, her 3 small children clinging to her skirts like frightened sparrows in a storm. A man with a silver-tongued smile and eyes as cold as a banker's heart, Bartholomew Thorne, held up a ledger. His voice, smooth and practiced, cut through the din. This woman's husband, God rest his soul, left behind a significant debt to me. A debt for a miracle cure that, alas, did not take. Now, the debt must be paid. He gestured to Elara and her triplets, Leo, Thea, and Iris, as if they were nothing more than property. She is strong, a hard worker, and her children, well, small hands can learn to work, too. A cruel snicker rippled through some of the onlookers. Sheriff Corbin, the law in this town, leaned against a post, arms crossed, his gaze indifferent. Elara's chin trembled, but she raised it, her eyes meeting Thorne's with a fire that refused to be extinguished. She was a mother, and her defiance was the only weapon she had left. Just as Thorne was about to open the bidding, a tall, silent figure detached himself from the shadows. A man who looked as weathered and unyielding as the mountains themselves. He stepped forward, and for the first time that day, a hush fell over the crowd. Who was this stranger, and could one man's courage stand against a town's silent complicity? Stay with us to witness a story of incredible strength and unexpected love. And if you believe that even in the harshest of lands, humanity deserves to be defended, then like this video, share it, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales that needed to be told. Part 1. A Debt of Despair. The sun beat down on Redemption's Bluff with the fury of a blacksmith's forge, bleaching the life from the very dust that coated every surface. It was a town built on the bones of failed prospectors and the fading whispers of fortune, a place where hope was a currency scarcer than water. And today, on the splintered planks of a makeshift auction block, hope was being sold to the lowest bidder. Elara Vance stood as still as a doe in a hunter's sights, the heat shimmering around her in waves. The worn calico of her dress was a map of her hardships, faded at the shoulders from countless hours under this same unforgiving sun, patched at the elbows from mending clothes by candlelight, and now clinging to her with the damp grip of fear. She was not a criminal, not an outlaw, but she was being treated as less than human. Her crime was widowhood. Her sentence was poverty. Around her, the town breathed its usual rhythm of commerce and cruelty. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer provided a percussive beat to the lowing of cattle being herded into pens. Men in dusty hats and sweat-stained shirts haggled over the price of grain and horses, their voices a gruff chorus of survival. But their eyes, whenever they strayed toward the platform, held a mixture of pity, contempt, and a grim sort of relief that it wasn't them standing up there. They were onlookers at the theater of misery, and Elara was the day's unwilling star. Her children were the heart-wrenching chorus. Leo, her little boy, brave and terrified, gripped a handful of her skirt so tightly his knuckles were white. His eyes, wide and dark, darted from the leering faces in the crowd to the imposing figure of Bartholomew Thorne. His sisters, Thea and Iris, hid behind their mother, their small faces buried in the fabric of her dress, their occasional whimpers like the cries of captured birds. They were too young to understand the complex mechanics of debt and ownership, but they understood the primal language of fear. They knew they were in danger. Bartholomew Thorne relished the attention. He was a man carved from the smooth, deceptive stone of a river rock, polished on the outside, but hard and cold to the core. He wasn't a native of the West. His tailored waistcoat and the silver gleam of his pocket watch spoke of city ways, of schemes hatched in smoke-filled rooms rather than under open skies. He had arrived in Redemption's Bluff a year ago with a wagon full of brightly colored bottles and promises of miracle cures. He had a salesman's charm and a predator's instinct for weakness. Elara's late husband, Daniel, had been his perfect mark, a good man driven to desperation by a sickness that ravaged his lungs, willing to believe in any promise, sign any paper, for a chance at life. Thorne held up the ledger now, its leather cover worn, its pages filled with the slanted, damning script of Daniel's final, foolish hope. "A debt of honor," Thorne announced, his voice carrying an oily sincerity that made Elara's stomach clench. $1,000 for the elixir that was to save him. A price he agreed to, a contract he signed. He wagered his land, his assets, his family. He let the word hang in the air, a poisoned dart. He was not just a creditor, he was a showman, turning a family's tragedy into a public spectacle. Standing near the edge of the crowd, a tin star pinned crookedly to his vest, was Sheriff Corbin. He was a man whose authority was as hollow as a rotted log. His face was a mask of bored indifference, but his presence was a powerful statement. It was a stamp of legitimacy on this grotesque proceeding. He was the law, and the law was not on Elara's side. The law belonged to the man with the heaviest purse, and in Redemption's Bluff, that man was Thorne. Corbin's gaze met Elara's for a fleeting moment, and in it, she saw nothing, no compassion, no conflict, just the flat, dead-end stare of a man who had long ago sold his conscience. This realization was colder than the fear itself. There would be no appeal, no justice. The system was not broken, it was owned. She tightened her arms around her children, her body forming a fragile shield. She would not beg. She would not weep. If her freedom was to be stripped away, she would face her captor with the last thing she owned, her dignity. She met Thorne's triumphant smirk with a look of pure, unadulterated defiance, a silent vow that he could buy her labor, but he could never own her soul. The crowd stirred, sensing the final act was about to begin. The air grew thick with anticipation. It was then, in that moment of suffocating silence, that a shadow detached itself from the wall of the general store and began to move. He moved with a quiet deliberation that seemed to bend the noise of the square around him. He wasn't a large man, not in the way Thorne's hired muscle, Jedediah, was large, a brute built of cheap whiskey and menace. This man was tall and lean, his frame honed by labor, not laziness. He wore a worn duster the color of the baked earth, and his hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow. As he walked, the crowd parted for him, not out of fear, but out of a sort of instinctual respect for a man who seemed to carry the weight of the wilderness itself on his shoulders. This was Silas Blackwood, a name that was more of a rumor than a known quantity in town. He was the solitary rancher from the high country, a man who came to town twice a year for supplies, spoke fewer words than a monk, and left as quietly as he arrived. Some said he was a veteran, haunted by the war. Others said he was an outlaw, hiding from his past. All they knew for sure was that he kept to himself, and his eyes held a sorrow that the mountains themselves seemed to have etched there. Silas stopped before the platform, his gaze not on Thorne, but on Elara and the children. For a long, silent moment. He just looked, and in that look, Elara felt something shift. He wasn't looking at her like property, or a pity case, or a spectacle. He was looking at her as a person, his eyes acknowledging the fire of defiance she held so tightly within her. It was a look of recognition, as if he knew the language of loss and despair intimately. He finally lifted his head, the brim of his hat rising just enough to reveal eyes the color of a stormy sky. He addressed Thorne, his voice low and raspy from disuse, yet it carried across the square with an undeniable authority. "What's the price?" Thorne, momentarily thrown off by the interruption, quickly recovered, a sneer twisting his lips. "Well, well, the hermit of Blackwood Ridge graces us with his presence. The price is $1,000, rancher. A sum I doubt you've seen in your lifetime." A few of Thorne's cronies chuckled. Silas ignored the jibe. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, into the inner pocket of his duster. The crowd leaned in, expecting a pistol, perhaps a wad of cash. Instead, he pulled out a small object wrapped in oilskin. He unwrapped it with a reverence that seemed out of place in the grimy square. Resting in his calloused palm was a woman's hair clasp, intricately carved from silver, shaped like a wild hawk in flight. It was old, tarnished in the crevices, but the craftsmanship was exquisite. It was an heirloom, a piece of a forgotten, more elegant world. "I don't have the full amount," Silas said, his voice steady. "But this is worth a damn sight more than your paper debt. It belonged to my mother." He placed the silver clasp on the edge of the auction platform. It glinted in the harsh sunlight, a beacon of quiet dignity in a sea of greed. "This is my deposit. I'll pay the rest. Let the woman and her children go." A ripple of disbelief went through the crowd. To trade such a treasure for a penniless widow and her brood? It was madness. Thorne stared at the clasp, his eyes glittering with a mixture of avarice and contempt. He recognized its value, but the public challenge to his authority infuriated him. "A pretty trinket," he scoffed. "But sentiment doesn't pay debts. I want $500 by sunrise tomorrow. Blackwood. The full 1,000 within the month. Or this," he gestured to the clasp, "is mine, and so are they." It was a trap, an impossible deadline. He wanted to humiliate Silas, to prove that in this town, money was the only power that mattered. Sheriff Corbin shifted his weight, a silent endorsement of Thorne's terms. Elara held her breath, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked at Silas, this stranger who was wagering a piece of his own history for her future. Silas did not flinch. He gave a single, sharp nod. "By sunrise." He didn't offer another word, no argument, no plea. He had made his terms. He turned his back on Thorne, his silent dismissal more insulting than any curse. He walked over to the wagon he'd parked near the livery, a simple, sturdy buckboard. He untied the reins and led the horse and wagon toward the platform. He stopped and looked up at Elara. He didn't offer a hand, didn't utter a word of comfort. He simply waited, his presence a quiet, unshakable promise. Elara hesitated for only a second. She looked at Thorne's smug face, then at the silver clasp shining on the rough wood. It was a choice between a gilded cage and an unknown wilderness. She gathered her children, her movements now sure and swift. "Come," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. She helped Leo, Thea, and Iris down from the platform and lifted them into the back of the buckboard. Then, without a backward glance, she climbed up onto the seat beside Silas Blackwood. As the wagon rolled out of the square, a cloud of dust rising behind them, the silver clasp was left behind, a silent testament to a bargain that had just been struck, not with money, but with honor. Part 2. The Silent Guardian's Shelter. The journey away from Redemption's Bluff was a passage from one world to another. The clamor of the market square faded, replaced by the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the soft clop of the horses' hooves on the hard-packed earth. Elara sat stiffly on the buckboard seat, her hands clenched in her lap, her back ramrod straight. She dared not look at the man beside her. Silas Blackwood drove the wagon with a steady, practiced hand, his gaze fixed on the trail ahead as it wound its way out of the scorched flatlands and into the rolling foothills. The silence between them was vast and heavy, filled with the unspoken questions that hung in the air like heat haze. Who was this man? What did he truly want from her? Gratitude warred with a deep, ingrained suspicion. In her experience, kindness from a man was rarely a gift. It was usually a down payment on a debt she would be forced to pay later, in ways that had little to do with money. In the back of the wagon, the triplets were a jumble of exhaustion and wonder. The initial fear had subsided, replaced by the resilient curiosity of childhood. They whispered amongst themselves, pointing at a hawk circling high overhead, their small voices a fragile counterpoint to the profound silence of the adults. Elara could feel their small movements, their warmth, and it anchored her. Whatever came next, she had them. They were her compass, her reason for enduring. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in strokes of orange and violet, the landscape changed. The dusty brown hills gave way to cooler, greener country. Tall pines began to dot the slopes, and the air grew crisp with the scent of resin and damp earth. The trail grew steeper, the wagon groaning as the horse strained against the incline. Silas remained a statue of quiet competence, navigating the ruts and rocks with an economy of movement that spoke of long familiarity with this path. He finally spoke when they reached a high ridge overlooking a secluded valley. His voice, when it came, startled her. "We're here." He gestured with his chin. Below them, nestled in a grove of aspen and pine, was his ranch. It was not a grand estate. There was no sprawling mansion, no armies of ranch hands. There was only a simple, sturdy log cabin with a wide porch, a well-built barn, and a few corrals. A thin ribbon of smoke curled from the stone chimney of the cabin, a welcoming beacon against the encroaching twilight. It was a place of solitude, a world unto itself, carved out of the wilderness with sheer force of will. There was an honesty to it, a lack of pretense that was both comforting and intimidating. This was a place built for survival, not for show. Silas guided the wagon down the final stretch of trail and pulled to a stop before the cabin. He climbed down without a word, his movements unhurried. He didn't wait for her to serve him or ask for permission. He walked to the back of the wagon and, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged exterior, lifted the children down one by one. Thea and Iris, weary from the long day, went without protest, their small hands clinging to his duster. Leo, ever the little man, tried to refuse the help, but his legs were stiff and he stumbled. Silas caught him easily, setting him on his feet before lifting him into his arms. He carried the boy inside, the other two trailing behind him. Elara watched, frozen for a moment, an ache spreading through her chest. It had been so long since anyone had helped her carry her burdens. She slid down from the wagon seat, her own legs unsteady, and followed them inside. The cabin was spare but clean. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering light over a simple wooden table, a few chairs, and a single bed in the corner, covered with a thick wool blanket. Silas had already laid the sleeping children on the bed, pulling the blanket over them with a careful hand. He then turned to the stove, poured water from a bucket into a tin cup, and handed it to her. His eyes met hers briefly, and they were unreadable. "You and the children sleep in here," he said, his voice a low rumble. "There's food in the pantry. I'll be in the barn." Before she could form a reply, before she could even say thank you, he had turned and walked out, the heavy wooden door creaking shut behind him, leaving her alone in the warmth and the quiet. She stood there for a long time, the tin cup of cool water trembling in her hands, listening to the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of her children. She waited for the other shoe to drop, for the knock on the door, for the price of this sanctuary to be named. But the only sound was the wind whispering through the pines outside. Sleep did not come easily to Elara that first night. She lay curled on the floor beside the bed where her children slept, a spare blanket Silas had left folded on a chair pulled tightly around her shoulders. Every creak of the cabin's logs, every gust of wind that moaned around the eaves, sent a jolt of anxiety through her. She was a creature conditioned by years of uncertainty, her senses honed to detect the slightest hint of danger. She listened for his footsteps returning, for the turn of the latch, for the quiet demand she had come to expect as the cost of a roof over her head. But the door remained closed. The night passed in a long, unbroken silence, disturbed only by the peaceful sighs of her children. When the first pale light of dawn filtered through the single window, she rose, feeling a bone-deep weariness that had little to do with her sleepless night. It was the exhaustion of a soul that had been fighting for too long. But ingrained habits die hard. The instinct to earn her keep, to prove her worth through labor, was a powerful one. She slipped out of the cabin into the crisp morning air, the dew cold on her bare feet. She found the water pump and, with a series of jarring, rusty groans, filled a bucket. She scrubbed the cabin floor until the worn planks shone. She found a small sack of cornmeal and a side of bacon in the pantry and set about making a breakfast she hoped would be acceptable. Her hands, raw and chapped from the lye soap and cold water, throbbed with a dull ache. She worked with a frantic, quiet energy, a desperate attempt to build a wall of usefulness around herself and her children. If she was indispensable, maybe he would let them stay. If she worked hard enough, maybe he wouldn't see them as a burden. She was stirring a pot of porridge over the fire when the cabin door creaked open. Silas stood there, backlit by the morning sun, his silhouette filling the doorway. He didn't move for a moment, just watched her. His gaze took in the scrubbed floor, the neat stack of firewood she'd brought in, the breakfast cooking on the stove, and finally, her red, swollen hands. A look she couldn't decipher flickered in his eyes. He stepped inside, bringing the scent of pine and cold morning air with him. He walked over to the stove, took the wooden spoon from her unresisting hand, and set it down on the hearth. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice calm but firm. It was not a suggestion. She flinched, expecting anger, a complaint that the porridge was lumpy or the floor wasn't clean enough. I just wanted to help," she stammered, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Your only job here," he said, and his voice softened slightly, "is to take care of them." He nodded toward the sleeping children. "That's all. That's the bargain." She finally looked up at him, truly looked at him in the clear light of day. His face was a landscape of harsh lines and old sorrows, his beard neatly trimmed, his eyes holding a quiet intelligence. He was not a monster. He was not a master. He was simply a man who had seen her not as a debt to be collected, but as a mother to be sheltered. The realization was so profound, so alien to her recent experience, that it left her speechless. A knot of emotion tightened in her throat, and she could only nod, unable to trust her voice. In the days that followed, a new, tentative rhythm began to establish itself. Silas would rise before dawn and tend to his ranch, his presence a steady, unobtrusive constant. He left them food, firewood, and most importantly, peace. He never intruded, never demanded. Elara, freed from the compulsion to perform the role of a servant, slowly began to reclaim a piece of herself. One afternoon, while the children napped, she walked the perimeter of the small clearing around the cabin. Her fingers trailed over the leaves of the wild plants growing near the woods. She recognized yarrow and chamomile and the broad leaves of plantain. A lifetime ago, her mother had taught her the names and uses of these plants, a gentle knowledge passed down through generations. An idea, the first spark of her own volition in a long time, took root. The next day, she found a rusty spade near the barn. She began to clear a small patch of earth on the sunny side of the cabin, her hands digging into the rich, dark soil. She transplanted the wild herbs, her movements careful and sure. It was hard work, but it felt different. This was not labor born of fear, but of purpose. As she knelt in the dirt, the sun warm on her back, coaxing life from the earth, Elara Vance began to plant a garden. It was a small act of defiance, a quiet declaration that she was more than a widow, more than a debtor. She was a healer, and she was, for the first time in a very long time, beginning to feel like she was home. Part 3. Whispers of the Past, Seeds of the Future. The peace they had found was as fragile as a wildflower. It was a shelter built in the path of a storm, and one evening in late autumn, the storm arrived. It rolled in from the north, a great, bruised mass of clouds that swallowed the mountains and suffocated the sky. The wind came first, a low, mournful howl that rattled the window panes and tore the last of the golden leaves from the aspen trees. Then came the rain, a cold, driving deluge that turned the world outside the cabin into a churning landscape of gray and black. Inside, a fire roared in the hearth, a defiant bastion of warmth and light against the tempest. The triplets, usually a whirlwind of energy, were subdued by the storm's fury. They sat huddled together on a rag rug before the fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, listening as Elara told them a story about a brave little rabbit who outsmarted a grumpy bear. But as the night wore on, a different kind of storm began to gather inside the cabin. It started with Leo. He grew quiet, his usual boisterous energy draining away. He complained of being cold, even as Elara wrapped him in another blanket. She laid a hand on his forehead, and her blood ran cold. He was burning with fever. His skin was hot and dry to the touch, and a faint, rosy flush had spread across his cheeks. By midnight, he was shivering uncontrollably, his small body racked with tremors, his breathing growing shallow and ragged. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Elara's carefully constructed composure. Sickness on the frontier was a swift and merciless predator. It had taken her husband, and she would be damned if it took her son. She did everything she knew. She bathed his forehead with cool water, but the fever seemed to mock her efforts, raging unabated. Leo's whispers became delirious, his eyes glassy and unfocused. The storm outside seemed to mirror the turmoil in her heart, each clap of thunder a drumbeat of dread. She felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. The door to the cabin opened with a gust of wind and rain, and Silas stepped inside, shaking the water from his duster. He had been out in the barn, securing the animals against the storm. He took one look at Elara's pale, stricken face and the shivering form of her son, and he understood immediately. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, his usual silence replaced by a focused intensity. He knelt beside Leo, his large, calloused hand gently touching the boy's forehead. He didn't offer empty platitudes or false reassurances. He simply assessed the situation, his expression grim. "The fever's high," he stated, his voice a low rumble beneath the howl of the wind. For a moment, Elara's resolve crumbled. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I've tried everything." Silas looked at her, his gaze steady. What does he need? It was a simple question, but it cut through her panic. He wasn't taking over. He was asking for her expertise. It was a sign of respect, an acknowledgement of her role as a mother and a healer. The question galvanized her. Her fear receded, replaced by a sharp, clear focus. Her garden. The herbs she had so carefully cultivated. "Willow bark," she said, her voice stronger now. "And elderflower, to bring down the fever and make him sweat. They're in the drying shed." Without another word, Silas turned and strode back out into the teeth of the storm. Elara watched him go, a dark figure swallowed by the tumultuous night. She turned back to her son, her hands no longer trembling. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She had knowledge. She had skill. And she had an ally, a silent guardian who was, at that very moment, battling a storm for her child. She began to boil a kettle of water, her movements swift and efficient. The fight was not over. It had just begun. Silas returned minutes later, soaked to the bone, his duster shedding water onto the floorboards. In his hands, he held a small bundle of dried herbs, their earthy, medicinal scent cutting through the smell of rain and wood smoke. He handed them to her, and their fingers brushed. It was a fleeting touch, but in it, an entire conversation passed between them, of trust, of shared purpose, of a partnership forged in the heart of a crisis. Elara worked with a focused grace, crushing the brittle willow bark and steeping the delicate elderflowers in the steaming water. The cabin filled with the fragrant steam, a scent of hope in the fever-sick room. Together, they coaxed the warm, bitter tea past Leo's lips, spoonful by spoonful. They sat on either side of the small bed, a silent, unified front against the sickness. They traded cloths soaked in cool water, wiping his brow, whispering words of comfort that were as much for each other as they were for the boy. The storm raged on, a wild symphony outside their small sanctuary, but inside, a profound quiet had settled. It was the quiet of 2 people working in perfect concert, their movements seamless, their understanding complete. Toward the darkest hour, just before the dawn, the fever broke. A sheen of sweat broke out on Leo's forehead, his shivering subsided, and his breathing deepened into the slow, even rhythm of peaceful sleep. Elara rested her head against the edge of the bed, relief washing over her in a wave so powerful it left her weak. She had done it. They had done it. She looked across the bed at Silas. He sat slumped in a chair, his head leaned back against the wall, his eyes closed in exhaustion. The firelight played across the harsh planes of his face, softening the lines of sorrow and solitude. In that moment, he was not her owner, not her savior, but her partner. The wall of silence that had defined their relationship had been weathered and worn down by the night's storm, revealing the solid bedrock of trust beneath. As the first light of a rain-washed dawn crept into the cabin, the silence was finally broken, not by necessity, but by a shared need for understanding. "Thank you," Elara said, her voice soft in the quiet room. Silas opened his eyes. "You're the one who saved him," he replied, his voice raspy with fatigue. "I just fetched the ingredients." She shook her head. "You went out in that storm. You trusted me." She paused, then found the courage to ask the question that had lingered for weeks. "Why? Why are you doing all of this, Silas?" He was quiet for a long time, his gaze distant, as if looking back through the years. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, heavy with the weight of memory. "When I was a boy, no older than Leo," he began, "my mother took sick. A lung fever, much like your husband's. We were sharecroppers. We had nothing. The landowner said medicine was a waste on a woman who couldn't work the fields anymore. He told us to leave." Elara's breath caught in her throat. Silas continued, his eyes fixed on the fire. "I carried her out of that house myself. She died the next morning, under a willow tree. I buried her with my bare hands." He finally looked at Elara, and she saw in his eyes the ghost of a helpless, heartbroken boy. "I swore that day," he said, his voice thick with an ancient pain, "that if I ever saw someone being thrown away like they were nothing, someone the world had given up on, I wouldn't just stand by. I couldn't save her, but I wasn't going to let another family be destroyed because of a rich man's greed." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and profound. It was the key that unlocked the mystery of his silence, the reason for his quiet, fierce protection. Now it was Elara's turn. "The debt," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't from gambling. It was for Thorne's miracle cure. Daniel was so desperate. He believed him. The elixir. It didn't just fail to work, Silas. It made him worse. I'm sure of it." They looked at each other, the full truth of their situation laid bare. Her fight was his fight. His past was her present. Bartholomew Thorne hadn't just created a debt, he had declared war on the memory of Silas's mother and the future of Elara's children. And in the quiet, storm-battered cabin, two survivors had just become soldiers in the same cause. Part 4. The Serpent's Shadow. The calm that followed the storm was deceptive, like the glassy surface of a deep, cold lake. On the ranch, an unspoken bond had been forged between Elara and Silas, a partnership solidified by a shared vigil and whispered confessions in the pre-dawn gloom. Leo recovered quickly, his childish laughter once again echoing in the small valley, a sound that was now a victory anthem for the two adults who had fought for it. Elara poured her energy into her garden with renewed purpose. It was no longer just a hobby or a way to reclaim a piece of her past. It was an arsenal. She tended to the plants with the meticulous care of a soldier cleaning his rifle, her knowledge of their properties, soothing, healing, or purging, her greatest weapon. Silas watched her, his silent presence a constant source of strength. He repaired the fence around her garden, making it stronger, and built a small cold frame to protect the more delicate herbs from the coming frost. His actions were his language, each hammer blow a declaration of his commitment to her cause. But shadows lengthen even in the quietest valleys. In Redemption's Bluff, Bartholomew Thorne was growing impatient. The silver hawk clasp sat on his desk, a beautiful, infuriating reminder of the woman who had defied him and the silent rancher who had enabled her. His initial plan to quickly break Blackwood's meager finances and reclaim his property had failed. Whispers had begun to circulate that the silent rancher was more than he seemed, that the widow Vance was not as helpless as she appeared. Thorne's power was built on a carefully crafted illusion of invincibility, and this loose end was beginning to unravel it. He needed to reassert his dominance, to remind the town that his will was law. He summoned Jedediah. Jedediah was a man who moved with the lumbering gait of a bear and had the soul of a weasel. He was Thorne's cudgel, the blunt instrument used to smash anything that charm and manipulation couldn't bend. Jedediah's arrival at the ranch was as subtle as a rock slide. He didn't ride up the main trail, but emerged from the woods, his horse trampling a patch of wildflowers. He tethered his mount to the new garden fence, the animal's hot breath clouding in the crisp air. Elara was washing clothes near the porch, the triplets playing a game with stones nearby, when she saw him. A cold dread washed over her, and she instinctively pulled the children behind her. Silas was in the far pasture, mending a section of fence that had been damaged in the storm. She was alone. Jedediah swaggered towards her, a cruel grin splitting his bearded face. "Well now," he drawled, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. Thorne was wondering how his investment was faring. "Looks like Blackwood's been keeping you well fed." He spat a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. "We are fine," Elara said, her voice tight but steady. "Please state your business and leave." Jedediah's grin widened. He enjoyed her fear, but her defiance intrigued him. "My business," he said, taking a step closer, "is to deliver a message. Mr. Thorne is a patient man, but his patience has its limits. The full debt is due, and he's added a bit of interest for the inconvenience." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "He wants you back in town. All of you." He then let his gaze drift to her garden, a patch of vibrant green and purple against the autumn brown. "What's all this?" he asked, feigning curiosity. He walked over to the fence, his heavy boots crushing the delicate chamomile she had planted along the border. He reached over and casually snapped the stem of a tall, flowering foxglove plant. "Pretty," he grunted. "Useless, though." Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. That was her digitalis, a powerful heart medicine. It was anything but useless. Before she could speak, Jedediah turned back to her, his eyes cold and hard. "Sunrise. 2 days. Or we'll come back to collect. And we won't be so polite next time." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a trail of broken plants and suffocating fear in his wake. Elara ran to her garden, her hands hovering over the crushed leaves and broken stems. He hadn't just trampled her plants, he had attacked her hope, her one source of agency in this fight. It was a declaration of war, aimed directly at her. When Silas returned at dusk, he found Elara sitting by the ravaged garden, a small trowel clutched in her hand, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The setting sun cast long shadows that looked like grasping fingers reaching for her small patch of life. He didn't need to ask what had happened. The tracks of Jedediah's horse were an ugly scar in the soft earth, and the broken plants told their own story of casual brutality. He stopped beside her, his own shadow falling over her. For a moment, he said nothing, just took in the damage, his jaw tightening, a muscle twitching in his cheek. The air grew cold and still around them. He knelt, his knees cracking, and picked up a bruised stem of lemon balm, rolling it between his thumb and forefinger, releasing its faint, sweet scent. "He'll pay for this," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. It was not a promise of vengeance, but a statement of fact, as inevitable as the coming winter. Elara finally looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of despair and a newly kindled anger. "It's not just the plants, Silas," she said, her voice trembling with rage. He looked at the children as if they were livestock he was coming to claim. "He looked at my garden. This is the only thing I have, the only skill that is truly mine." And he tried to crush it under his boot as if it were a weed. The violation was personal, deep, and it had transformed her fear into a hard, cold resolve. She would not be a victim. She would not wait to be collected. That night, the mood in the cabin was somber. Silas cleaned his rifle with slow, methodical movements, the soft rasp of the oilcloth a grim counterpoint to the crackling fire. He was preparing for a fight. Elara, however, was preparing for a different kind of battle. The next day, Silas rode to a neighboring ranch, miles down the valley, to trade for a sack of winter flour. It was a necessary trip, but he made it with a heavy heart, reluctant to leave them alone. While he was gone, a visitor arrived, not a threat, but a plea. It was Martha, the wife of a blacksmith from town, a woman who had always offered Elara a kind word in the market. Her face was pale with worry, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. "It's my Sarah," Martha whispered, her voice choked with tears. "She's sick. The doctor says it's just a grippe, but she's burning up, just like your Daniel did, after he started taking Mr. Thorne's tonic." The words struck Elara like a physical blow. She invited the woman inside, her mind racing. Here it was. A chance to fight back, not with a gun, but with her knowledge. A chance to prove Thorne was not a healer, but a poisoner. It was a terrible risk. Helping this child would be a direct challenge to Thorne, an act of open rebellion. But looking at Martha's desperate face, Elara saw a reflection of her own terror on the night Leo had been sick. She thought of Silas's story, of his mother dying for want of care. She could not stand by. "I can't promise anything," Elara said, her voice firm. "And you must not tell anyone where you got this. Not yet." She went to her stores of dried herbs, the ones she had managed to harvest before Jedediah's visit. She worked quickly, her hands sure as she measured and mixed a combination of willow bark, yarrow, and peppermint. She wrapped the herbs in a cloth and pressed them into Martha's hands, along with careful instructions. Give her this tea every 2 hours. Keep her cool. And pray. After Martha left, a new energy coursed through Elara. She was no longer just defending her own small family. She had taken a stand for the town. When Silas returned, he saw the look in her eyes and knew something had changed. She told him what she had done. He listened, his expression unreadable. He did not scold her for the risk she had taken. He simply gave a slow nod. "Then we'd best be ready for what comes next," he said. The line had been drawn. The battle for Redemption's Bluff was about to begin. Part 5. The Reckoning at Dawn. The news arrived 3 days later, not with a shout, but as a rumor carried on the wind. Silas had ridden into town for salt and nails, a trip he now made with a loaded rifle resting across his saddle. He returned with more than supplies. His face was set in a grim, determined line. "The blacksmith's girl," he said as he dismounted, his voice low. "Her fever broke. She's weak, but she's going to live." The words hung in the air of the quiet ranch yard, momentous and heavy. Elara's remedy had worked. A life had been saved. And in doing so, a seed of doubt had been planted in the heart of Redemption's Bluff. For the first time, the town had seen a clear choice. Thorne's expensive, ineffective tonic on one hand, and the widow's free, potent herbs on the other. The story spread through the town like a grass fire. It was whispered over laundry lines and store counters, discussed in hushed tones in the saloon. Martha, overwhelmed with gratitude, could not keep the secret entirely. She didn't name Elara, but she spoke of a kindness from the hills, of old ways and true healing. It was enough. The people of Redemption's Bluff, long cowed into submission by Thorne's wealth and Sheriff Corbin's complicity, began to look at him differently. They saw the fear in the eyes of other parents whose children had been treated with his elixir. They remembered the sudden, unexplained deaths. The whispers grew louder, turning from gossip into accusation. Thorne felt the shift in the town's atmosphere like a change in barometric pressure. The deference he was accustomed to was replaced by questioning glances. The fear he commanded was curdling into resentment. His empire, built on lies, was beginning to crumble. The blacksmith's daughter wasn't just a recovery, she was a rebellion in miniature, and Elara Vance was its unnamed leader. His fury was absolute. This penniless widow and her silent, stubborn guardian had done more to damage his authority in a week than any business rival had in a year. They had not only defied him, they had exposed him. He would not allow it. This had to end, not with threats, but with an absolute and brutal display of power. He summoned Sheriff Corbin and Jedediah to his office. The pretense of civility was gone. "We are going out to the Blackwood Ranch," Thorne announced, his voice dangerously calm as he poured 3 glasses of whiskey. "We are going to collect my property and put an end to this sentimental nonsense." Sheriff Corbin shifted uncomfortably. "Bart, the whole town's talkin'. Maybe we should just let it go." Thorne slammed his glass down on the desk, the whiskey sloshing over the rim. "Let it go?" he snarled, his mask of charm falling away to reveal the ugliness beneath. "They are laughing at me. At you. They think we are weak. We are going to remind them what real power looks like. We ride at dawn." Jedediah grinned, cracking his knuckles. He had been waiting for this. Corbin, his face pale, looked from Thorne's enraged face to Jedediah's eager one and knew he had no choice. He drained his whiskey in one gulp. On the ranch, Silas saw the signs. He had seen them 100 times before on the battlefield. The unnatural quiet from the town. The way a lone rider had watched his property from a distant ridge the day before. He knew an attack was not just possible, it was inevitable. He did not tell Elara his suspicions, not in words. He didn't need to. She saw it in the way he checked the perimeter fence, the way he barred the cabin door at night, the quiet tension in his shoulders. That evening, he didn't sit by the fire. He took her outside, into the clear, cold night, under a canopy of brilliant stars. "If they come," he said, his voice soft but urgent, "you take the children and you run. Head for the high rocks behind the barn. Don't stop. Don't look back." He pressed a small hunting knife into her hand. "Just in case." She looked from the knife to his face, her heart aching. "What about you?" she whispered. He looked toward the dark trail that led to town. "I'll do what a man's got to do," he said simply. To protect his home. Dawn broke cold and gray, the sun a pale, reluctant disk behind a veil of mist. The attack came just as Silas had predicted, 3 riders, dark silhouettes against the morning sky, appeared at the edge of the valley. Thorne, Corbin, and Jedediah. They rode with the arrogant confidence of men who believed they were untouchable, expecting to find a sleeping cabin and a terrified family. They were wrong. As they entered the main yard, they found nothing. The cabin was dark. The porch was empty. An eerie silence hung over the ranch. "He's run off," Jedediah grunted, spitting on the ground. "Coward." But Thorne felt a prickle of unease. This was too easy. "Spread out," he commanded. "Check the barn." Jedediah dismounted and kicked open the barn door, striding into the cavernous gloom. He saw nothing but hay bales and empty stalls. He took a step further in, and then the world fell out from under him. A section of the floorboards, carefully loosened, gave way, dropping him into the shallow manure pit below. It wasn't deep, but it was enough to trap him, his leg twisting under him with a sickening crack. He bellowed in pain and rage. Outside, hearing the cry, Corbin drew his pistol, his eyes darting nervously. "It's a trap!" he yelled. At that moment, a rope, stretched taut between 2 corral posts, was released. It whipped across the yard, snagging Corbin's feet and pulling him from his saddle. He landed hard, the wind knocked out of him, his gun flying from his grasp. From the shadows of the woodshed, Silas emerged, not with a rifle blazing, but with the quiet efficiency of a ghost. He scooped up the sheriff's pistol and leveled it at him. "Stay down, Sheriff," he said, his voice calm. Thorne, still mounted, watched in stunned disbelief as his entire plan disintegrated in seconds. His brute force was neutralized. His legal authority was disarmed and lying in the dirt. He was alone. He turned his horse, intending to flee, but a figure blocked his path. It was Elara. She stood before him, not with a weapon, but with a small bundle of herbs in her hand. She was not hiding. She was not afraid. Her eyes burned with a cold fire. "It's over, Thorne," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying in the still morning air. Thorne laughed, a harsh, incredulous sound. "You? You think you can stop me?" "She already has," came a new voice. From the trail leading to the ranch, a group of men appeared. It was the blacksmith, holding a hammer like a weapon. It was the owner of the general store. It was a half-dozen other townsmen, their faces grim, their hands holding not guns, but tools of their trade, axes, pitchforks, wrenches. They had seen the riders leave at dawn and had followed, no longer willing to be passive spectators. They had chosen a side. They formed a silent, unmovable wall behind Elara. Thorne's face went pale. The people he had terrorized and swindled were now his jury. Elara stepped forward and held up the herbs. "This is what heals," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction. She then pointed a trembling finger at Thorne. "And you sell poison. You prey on the desperate and the dying. You killed my husband. You tried to poison the blacksmith's daughter. You are not a businessman. You are a murderer." The blacksmith stepped forward, his eyes blazing with a father's protective fury. "She's right. I saw what your tonic did. And I saw what her herbs did." The crowd murmured in agreement, their collective anger a low, dangerous hum. Sheriff Corbin, still on the ground, knew the game was up. His authority was a joke. He didn't move. Thorne looked at the ring of hostile faces, and for the first time, true fear flickered in his eyes. His money couldn't save him. His hired gun was groaning in a pit of manure. His bought and paid-for lawman was useless. He had been defeated not by a gun, but by a garden, and not by a soldier, but by a mother. Part 6. A home forged in courage. The confrontation did not end in a blaze of gunfire, but in the quiet, decisive judgment of a community that had finally found its voice. The townsmen surrounded Thorne, their expressions a mixture of anger and grim satisfaction. It was the blacksmith who stepped forward, taking the reins of Thorne's expensive horse. "We'll be taking Mr. Thorne back to town," he said, his voice resonating with a newfound authority. "There's a federal marshal due in a month. I reckon he'll be very interested in hearing about a man who sells poison and tries to enslave widows." He looked over at Sheriff Corbin, who was slowly getting to his feet, dusting himself off with as much dignity as he could muster. "As for you, Corbin," the blacksmith said with utter contempt, "I suggest you start riding, and don't stop." Corbin didn't need to be told twice. Without a word, he retrieved his horse and rode away, not a lawman, but a disgraced coward fleeing the town he had failed to protect. Jedediah was hauled, cursing and groaning, out of the manure pit and tied to his own saddle, his broken leg a painful testament to his defeat. The impromptu posse led their prisoners away, their departure marking the end of a reign of terror. As they disappeared down the trail, a profound silence descended upon the ranch once more, but this time it was not a silence of tension or fear, but of peace. The morning mist had burned away, and the sun shone down, illuminating a world that felt cleansed, reborn. Elara stood in the yard, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the confrontation. Silas walked to her side. He didn't speak, just gently took the hunting knife from her hand. Its purpose served. Their eyes met, and in that shared glance was a universe of understanding. They had faced the serpent and won. In the days that followed, the ranch became a place of pilgrimage. The blacksmith and his wife, Martha, arrived with a freshly baked apple pie and the news that Thorne and Jedediah were being held in the town jail under citizen guard. Others came too, bringing sacks of flour, jars of preserves, and offers of help. They came to thank Elara, the woman they now called the Healer of the Hills. They came to nod their respect to Silas, the man they now knew as the Guardian. The isolation of the ranch was broken, not by threats, but by the threads of a newly woven community. Elara, once an outcast to be sold, was now the heart of that community. Her garden became a source of healing for the whole town, and she taught the other women about the herbs, sharing the knowledge her mother had given her. Silas, the solitary hermit, found himself sharing coffee on his porch with his neighbors. The ghosts of his past had not vanished, but they no longer haunted his every step. In protecting Elara's family, he had found a way to heal himself. The cabin, once a temporary, desperate shelter, began to transform into a home. Elara stitched new curtains for the window from a bolt of calico a grateful neighbor had given her. Silas added a new room for the children, the sound of his hammer and saw a cheerful, constructive rhythm that replaced the memory of fear. Leo, Thea, and Iris, blissfully unaware of the danger they had escaped, thrived in the atmosphere of peace and security. Their laughter was the truest measure of the victory their parents had won. The debt of despair had been cancelled, not with money, but with courage. The shadow of the serpent was gone, leaving only the warm, life-giving sun. The ranch was no longer a refuge from the world, but a part of it, a testament to the fact that a home is not just a structure of logs and nails, but a fortress built of love, trust, and resilience. Spring arrived in the high valley not as a sudden event, but as a slow, gentle unfurling. The last patches of snow melted from the shadows, feeding the small creek that ran through the pasture. The aspen trees sprouted tiny, trembling leaves of the most vibrant green, and the meadows erupted in a riot of wildflowers, blue lupine, Indian paintbrush, and sunny yellow daisies. The world felt new, washed clean of the previous year's hardships. Life on the ranch had found its own peaceful, enduring rhythm, as steady and reassuring as the turning of the seasons. Elara's garden, now triple its original size, was a tapestry of color and scent. The children's voices were a constant, happy melody as they helped their mother weed the beds or chased butterflies through the tall grass. Silas had changed. The deep-set sorrow in his eyes had not disappeared entirely. Some scars are too deep to ever fully fade, but it was now tempered by a quiet contentment. He smiled more, a slow, rare thing that transformed his rugged face. He would often stop his work simply to watch Elara in her garden, or to listen to the children telling him a rambling story. This small, vibrant family had filled the vast, silent spaces of his life. He was no longer just a survivor of a long-ago war. He was a husband in all but name, a father in all but blood. He was home. One bright afternoon, when the sun was warm on their shoulders and the air was sweet with the scent of lavender and thyme, Silas came to find Elara in her garden. She was kneeling in the dirt, humming softly to herself as she tied up a stray tomato vine. He stood for a moment, just watching her, a familiar ache of affection in his chest. She belonged here, among the life she cultivated, as much as any flower. He walked towards her, his footsteps soft on the earth. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun, a smile touching her lips. "Silas," she said, her voice warm. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he knelt in front of her, his knees pressing into the soft soil. From his pocket, he took a small, cloth-wrapped object. He unwrapped it carefully. It was the silver hawk clasp. He had spent hours polishing it, removing every last trace of tarnish until it shone with the brilliance of a captured star. "This," he began, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed, was a deposit on a debt that was never owed. He held it out on his open palm. "Then it became a memory of my mother, a way to honor her." He looked directly into Elara's eyes, his own gaze clear and steady. "But now, it's neither of those things. Now, it's a promise." Elara's breath caught. She looked from the gleaming silver clasp to the face of the man who had become her entire world. "A promise," he continued, "of more sunrises like this one, of more seasons. A promise to protect this family, this home we've built, for all of my days. It's not a bargain, Elara. It's a question." He gently took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her own. "Will you build that future with me?" Tears welled in Elara's eyes, but they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She didn't need words. She simply closed her fingers over his, enclosing the silver clasp between their joined hands. Her answer was in her shining eyes, in the radiant smile that broke across her face. It was yes. It had always been yes. He carefully fastened the clasp in her hair, the cool silver a perfect contrast to its warm, brown strands. It was not a brand of ownership, not a payment on a debt, but a crown, a symbol of a queen in her own garden, a partner by his side. They rose together, and with the children laughing around them, a family forged not in law or blood, but in the crucible of courage and kindness, they turned to face their future together. In a world where a woman could be sold like cattle and a child's cry was silenced by a fraudulent debt, one man stood up, not to own, but to honor. He was a silent guardian who saw past the dirt and desperation to the fire of defiance in a mother's eyes. And one woman, broken by betrayal and loss, discovered that her greatest strength was not just her will to survive, but her power to heal. She learned that a garden could be an arsenal, that kindness could be a weapon, and that true freedom wasn't given, but earned through courage. This was not a simple tale of rescue. It was the story of redemption, earned through shared struggle and quiet understanding. It was a story of dignity, reclaimed from the hands of a tyrant by a community that finally found its voice. Most of all, it was the story of a family born not from convenience or contract, but from a conscious, daily choice to love, to protect, and to build a home where once there was only a wilderness of sorrow. They proved that even in the dust and danger of the old frontier, the most fertile ground for a new beginning is a courageous and compassionate heart. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that true value lies in character, not coin, then please like, share, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. Join us for our next journey into the past, where every story reminds us that even when the world seems its darkest, love still has the final, enduring word.